I feel I'm definitely an American, and it's from that basis that I deal with the United States and Japan. So I guess in that sense, I don't really have too much to offer in terms of people on the identity issue. Although my advice would be um, decide who you are and stick to who you are, and don't be kind of misled into thinking that you can be someone you're not.
Episode 18, Be an Actor, Not a Bridge, with Japanese American leader and philanthropist Glen S. Fukushima. Hello, everyone. I'm incredibly honored to welcome today Mr. Glen Fukushima, who I believe many of you know. He's currently a visiting fellow at Stanford University, but his decades-long experience as a government and business leader include his roles as the former Deputy Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Japan and China, as well as the President of the American Chamber of Commerce of Japan. He's also a philanthropist and leader in U.S. Japan relations. He served on numerous boards, including the U.S. Japan Council, where I had the good fortune of meeting him. He's established scholarships under his name, including a Fulbright Fund, supporting the next generation of leaders for the U.S. Japan relationship. He also belongs to several think tanks and is a frequent commentator, speaker, and moderator in both English and Japanese, with topics ranging from security to business to politics. Today, I'm excited to ask Glen about his unique upbringing going back and forth between the US and Japan, his career spanning government, business, and academia, as well as how his identity has developed over time. So, thank you very much, Glen, for joining me today.
Sure, thank you for inviting me.
May I first start by asking where you were born and raised?
Sure. Well, I was born in Japan, but I was never a Japanese citizen because the reason I was born in Japan was that my father, who was a second generation Japanese American, a Nisei, he was born and raised in the Los Angeles area, and during World War II, he and his family were interned in an internment camp in Colorado. But when he joined the U.S. Army, he ended up in Japan after the war. And so he was with the U.S. Army based in Japan. And so I was born in Japan, but as a U.S. citizen on a U.S. Military base at a U.S. military hospital. I grew up primarily in Japan and in the United States, mainly in California. But my father, because of his work, uh, when I was in Japan, I was mainly, not exclusive, but mainly growing up on U.S. military bases.
Mm.
And so I went back and forth when I was a child, so that by the time I applied to college, when I applied in my senior year to college, and I had to list the schools I had gone to, I had to list 12 different schools
Oh, my goodness.
because on average, altogether, it was one school per year.
Wow. Thank you very much for that. And I'm really fascinated by it because I think we hear so many stories of Japanese American military personnel who go back to the United States after they fight in wars abroad. But were there a lot of people like that, Japanese Americans in the US military who were based in Japan at that time? Or did you know others who were like you?
Yes, there are a number of others. In fact, I knew quite a few people like me whose fathers were Japanese Americans in the U.S. military or civilians who were working for the U.S. military in Japan, but they had married Japanese women,
Hmm.
and therefore, like me, they grew up with a Japanese mother and a Japanese American father. And so I think there's a sizable population of Japanese Americans like me. Although we can get into this later, but I think there are at least four varieties of Japanese Americans,
Mm.
and that is one variety. But another is those who were born and raised in Hawaii,
Hmm.
and then a third would be those born and raised on the West Coast, and then those who are born and raised in other parts of the United States, not the West Coast. So, in my experience, there are at least four different categories of Japanese Americans, but that one category is those whose fathers are Japanese American, mothers Japanese, and grew up partly in Japan because of the father being in the U.S. military.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, thank you so much for that. So it sounds like you were able to grow up with others who were like you, and so you were able to probably confide in them about any struggles you may have had with their identity and things like that. Is that correct?
Well, yes and no. When I was in Japan, the Japanese Americans I knew were primarily those who were like me, um, fathers who were Japanese American, mothers who were Japanese. So many of these people could speak Japanese but couldn't read or write
Mm.
Japanese. Um, Often they spoke Japanese with their mothers, English with their fathers, like I did. And then when I went to high school in Los Angeles, I met quite a few Japanese Americans. Actually, the high school I went to at that time, Gardena High School, was a school where at the peak, about 24% of the graduating class was Japanese American.
Wow.
And so Irene Hirano, for instance, was 1 year ahead of me at Gardena High School.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and that's where I knew her in Gardena High School. And Dale
Wow.
Minami, a very
Mhm.
prominent Japanese American attorney,
Mhm.
he also was a Gardena High School graduate. There's a guy named Warren Fruitani, very active in California politics. He's a Gardena graduate. A guy named Garrett Hongo, a rather well-known poet, but he's also. And so there are a lot of Gardena High School graduates, but those Japanese Americans I knew at Gardena High School were primarily those who were born and raised in Los Angeles, had never been to Japan.
Mhm.
They may have studied Japanese maybe on the weekends, but they couldn't speak Japanese very much.
Mhm.
And the Japanese they knew was very, very minimal. So that was a second variety. And then when I went to college at Stanford, for the first time, I really got to know Japanese Americans from Hawaii, because at that time, when I went to
Mhm.
Stanford as an undergraduate, about half of the Japanese Americans were from Hawaii, and they were mainly from Iolani and Punahou,
Mhm.
very elite prep schools in Hawaii. So, and then when I went to Harvard, then I ran across a whole group of other Japanese Americans, like Francis Fukuyama and others, who were primarily raised on the East Coast in a totally non-Japanese American environment.
Mhm.
So each of those Japanese Americans have a very different outlook
Mhm.
on the world and towards Japan.
Mhm.
So I find it very frustrating often because, Japanese professors or Japanese journalists will
Mhm.
spend like a year at University of Hawaii or a year at UCLA, and they write a book saying this is Japanese Americans.
Mhm.
But Japanese Americans are extremely diverse.
Right.
I mean, there are all kinds of Japanese Americans, as you know from your experience in
Mhm.
the U.S. Japan Council. And
Mhm.
so when you ask the question about identity, I suppose there are some Japanese Americans who had a similar experience of growing up partly in Japan
Mhm.
that could understand some of my experiences, and maybe some who from the West Coast. But, in some ways, I'm kind of unusual. And
Mhm.
so I don't, I haven't come across too many Japanese Americans that have had similar experiences to me.
I see.
That is, having grown up in the U.S. and Japan, basically in a military um, base environment, especially in Japan,
Mhm.
and then going to school partly on the West Coast and having a lot of experiences with Japanese Americans from Hawaii,
Mhm.
but also spending time for 8 years at Harvard, where there were many of the Japanese Americans there were people who had no experience
Mhm.
with Japan or the West Coast. And then I went to a place like Deep Springs College, which
Mhm.
nobody's ever heard of, and I turned down Stanford and Pomona and Reed and others to go
Oh,
there. And then
wow. Mhm.
I worked at USTR, which
Mhm.
very few Japanese Americans have done. And then
Mhm.
I worked at Airbus, a European company, which very few Japanese Americans have done.
Mhm.
So I guess there aren't too many people who I share life experiences with.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. That makes sense. Thank you so much. So, did you think about U.S.-Japan relations from a very young age because you had to go back and forth, and was that something that you were interested in, like that you wanted to bring the two countries that you know so well closer together?
No. Until I went to college, I think going back and forth between U.S. and Japan was kind of a natural thing. I
Mm.
just thought it's kind of a byproduct of my upbringing, and so I never really thought of Japan as a subject of study or a subject of
Mm.
profession.
Mhm.
When I was going to college at Stanford, well, first when I went to East Springs College, originally I thought I wanted to become a medical doctor. But then, because I got involved in political activity during the war in Vietnam, I switched. I got much more interested in politics. And so I studied history and economics. And at that time, I thought I wanted to go to law school and be a lawyer. And being like a civil rights attorney was something that I found very attractive. So I was kind of on my path to becoming a lawyer. And then I was introduced to a program at Stanford to spend time studying at Keio University. And so in the summer of 1969, I spent a summer as a Stanford student with 11 other Stanford students for the summer at Keio in Japan. And that's when I got my first exposure to Japan, apart from my father's work being in Japan on U.S. military bases. So that's when I first had contact with the real Japan, as opposed to the U.S. bases. And then during those 2 months, there was a host family in Japan that I stayed with for 2 months. They had 3 sons. All 3 of them were Keio. The eldest had already graduated, was working, but the younger 2 sons were Keio students at the time. And so we became friends, and the family treated me very well. And so I started getting interested in Japan, and more kind of aside from having just been brought up, in Japan and the U.S. And then I had the opportunity so that was 1969. Then 1970, I was invited by some friends to apply and participate in the Japan-America Student Conference. And this was the 22nd annual Japan-America Student Conference. The conference started in 1934 and went till 1940. And then it was disbanded during the war and then restarted after the war. But at that conference, I made many Japanese friends, and I met the woman who 2 years later, we got married from Japan. And then, aside from that, in 1971-72, I spent a year at Keio University to actually study. And while I was there at Keio, although my main time was spent studying Japanese language, I did sit in on 2 seminars at Keio. And one of the seminars was a seminar on U.S. Japan relations, taught in Japanese. But that year, there was a professor named Gerald Curtis, who had just gotten his PhD from Columbia in 1969. And he was a visiting assistant professor and was co-teaching the course with Kamiya Fuji, who was the professor at Keio who usually taught the seminar on U.S. Japan relations. So I sat in on that seminar, and that's what actually prompted me to think, well, maybe Japan is a subject of study that I could, it's a subject I might be involved in as a profession, as opposed to just kind of being a hobby or something, that I happened to grow up, partly in Japan. And actually, that seminar that Gerald Curtis and Kamiya Fuji taught, the subject of that seminar was the occupation of Japan, 1945 to 1952. And one of the organizations during the occupation of Japan that we didn't actually study, but I learned about at the time, was an organization called the American Council on Japan. This was a group of American business people involved, interested in Japan. And that was 1971-72. But in 2009, when the U.S. Japan Council began, some people involved in the U.S. Japan Council wanted to have Japanese American in the name of the organization. But I thought, and I was thinking about the Committee of 100, the Chinese American organization, I thought that the U.S. Japan Council, that the organization being created by the Japanese Americans, Irene Hirano and Frank Sogi and Henry Ota and so forth, that it should have a more neutral sounding name. And thinking about the American Council on Japan, which I had studied about 1971, I proposed the name U.S. Japan Council. And Senator Inoue and Irene Hirano liked the name. So that's how the organization was named U.S. Japan Council.
Wow, it's incredible that it's all connected. You went to high school with Irene, you
Right.
studied under Jerry Curtis and naming U.S. Japan Council. Thank you so much for that incredible story. And I'm really fascinated too that your study abroad experience really shaped who you are today, like really committed to U.S. Japan relations.
Yeah. So Jerry Curtis was the one who said, there aren't too many Americans studying U.S. Japan relations. Why don't you consider going into that as a profession?
Hmm.
And that's what prompted me to think, well, maybe. And so actually, after that, I went back to Stanford to graduate, then went to Japan and got married, and then spent 2 years working and studying and preparing to go to graduate school. And when I went to graduate school in 1974 at Harvard, I went there originally with the plan to get a PhD and go into teaching.
Mm.
And then after getting a master's and a PhD program in sociology, did everything except the dissertation, and was a teaching fellow for Ezra Vogel and David Reisman and Edwin Reischauer. I decided I really didn't want to be a professor. And so
Mm.
that's what led me to go to law school and business school in a joint JD MBA program.
Hmm.
And so I ended up spending 8 years in graduate school at Harvard,
Hmm.
1 year in a master's, 3 years in a PhD program, and 4 years in law school and business school.
Wow.
Um, so then I got finished at Harvard, and then I had a Fulbright grant to study
Hmm.
at the University of Tokyo. And after that, I joined a law firm, and I thought I was going to just practice law. And then in 1985, I got an offer to work for USTR, Office of the
Hmm.
U.S. Trade Representative,
Hmm.
first as Director for Japanese Affairs, and then later I was promoted to be Deputy Assistant U.S. Trade Representative for Japan and China.
Hmm.
But if I hadn't gotten that offer to work at USTR, I probably would not have ended up focusing so much on Japan. But
Mm.
because of because I think I probably would have ended up being a regular corporate attorney. But
Mm.
because of that experience for 5 years, very intensively working on Japan and the U.S. government, that kind of naturally led me to work on Japan-related activities after I left the government.
I
And so
see.
for 22 years, after leaving USTR, I worked for 4 American companies and 1 European company based in
Hmm.
Japan primarily.
Hmm.
But because the environment at the time, in the 1980s and 90s and into the 2000s, I think Japan was considered such an important market,
Hmm.
both as a market to sell products to and services to, and also as a market, in some cases, as a competitor. There were many opportunities to work for companies, American and European companies, that thought Japan was important.
Hmm. Hmm. Thank you so much. And going back to your years at USTR, so I
Mm-hmm.
think the US government was incredibly lucky to have someone like you at the helm when there were so many trade frictions and a lot of tensions. And I was wondering if you could talk about some occasions where your thorough knowledge of Japanese culture, the society, and the language was able to lower the tensions a little bit and able to negotiate in a peaceful and cordial manner with Japan.
Well, most of the discussions and negotiations between the U.S. Japan on government to government level are done in English and in Japanese using interpreters
Mhm.
like you. But there were some cases, for instance, on the U.S. Japan lawyers issue, where the Japanese Ministry of Justice, they didn't speak English by and large.
Mm.
So I had many informal discussions with them in Japanese.
Mm.
And that, I think, was helpful in moving the discussions along
Mhm.
in a more kind of direct and straightforward manner, rather than having to use an interpreter and spend a lot of time. And I think so, yeah. And I have one specific example about how my knowledge about Japan, I think, really helped me, and that is that um, often, when the two sides would have a start with negotiation in Tokyo,
Mhm.
and say after the first day
Mhm.
of negotiations, the Japanese government would say, "What should we tell the press?" And the U.S. side would say, "We're still negotiating. We haven't reached a conclusion, so we don't plan to tell the press anything."
Mhm.
And the Japanese government will say, "No, no, no. We have to tell the press because they're all waiting outside, waiting for us to tell them
Mm.
what kind of progress we made." So then sometimes we would spend 10 minutes, sometimes we spend an hour
Wow.
negotiating about what we would tell the media.
Mhm.
And then the next day, you look at the newspaper, and it's completely different from what we had agreed to.
Oh no.
Now, many of my colleagues in the U.S. government thought, "Oh, the Japanese screwed us again. They stabbed us in the back. They made these promises. They reneged. They
Mhm.
lied to us."
Mhm.
Well, what I realized is that actually the way that the Japanese media works is that there's so many levels of contact between the Japanese media and the Japanese government officials.
Mhm.
There's the official press conference, and then there's a informal press briefing,
Right.
and then there's this yomawari. Yomawari, where
Right.
the Japanese journalists wait at the homes of the officials at 11 or 12 o'clock at night, waiting for
Mhm.
them to come home, and they grab them, and sometimes the wives allow them into the living room to drink while they're waiting for the officials to come back. And
Mhm.
in time for the deadline of 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning for the newspapers, these officials give information to these journalists.
Right.
But these journalists would feed that information to the editor, and often the person writing the articles has no notion of what's actually going on. He or she just gets information from all sorts of places, all different journalists,
Mm.
and puts them together, and then someone else puts a headline. So it's not necessarily the Japanese government that the Japanese government lied to the Japanese media and resulting in these articles that were completely different from what the governments had agreed to.
Mhm.
Is that the way the media works in Japan is completely different from the way it works in the United States.
Mhm.
But because I had studied in Japan and I had many friends who were Japanese journalists, I understood how they worked. And so,
Mhm.
you know, I wasn't happy about what happened, but I didn't hold it personally against the Japanese government officials. I didn't accuse them of lying
Mm.
because usually I don't think they did.
I see.
So that's just kind of one example, but there are many, many other examples like that,
Mhm.
where the fact that I knew about Japan helped me to understand what was going on
Mhm.
and led me to be, I think, more neutral and objective in dealing
Mhm.
with Japan and less emotional, because
Mhm.
some Americans got very, very emotional because they didn't fully understand how Japan worked.
Mhm. Mhm. Thank you for that example. I think that's super helpful. And you're absolutely right about how the way journalists work is very different. And I think things are changing now. It's more becoming like similar to other global and Western media. But I think especially during that time, it's so much
Yeah, this
about,
was a long time ago.
yeah, so much about like communication and the time spent after work and whatnot.
Mhm. And as you say, recently more articles in Japanese newspapers are byline. They have the individual writers.
Hmm.
So there's one person who's responsible for the article. In those days, it was often the case that various people would submit information, and so it was kind of a mishmash of information from all sorts of different sources.
Hmm.
And so often the articles ended up being inaccurate, or
Mm.
certainly being different from what the two governments agreed that the Japanese government would tell the Japanese media.
Right. That's so fascinating. I had no idea about that. Thank you. And moving on to the private sector, so you mentioned Airbus Japan, and you've also worked for companies like AT&T, but I think working for these business companies that have this technical expertise is quite challenging. So, what was your criteria in choosing specific companies to work for?
Well, one criterion was, is it a successful company? Is it a strong company, competitive company?
Mm,
And also, is it an interesting company where I could learn something?
mm,
And so the four American companies, the first was AT&T. Second was Arthur D. Little, management consulting firm.
mm,
The third was Cadence Design Systems, a Silicon Valley software company. The fourth was NCR Corporation, and the fifth was Airbus. But in each of those, there was some special attraction. I had several other offers that I turned down, and in many cases, well, in some cases, it was fortunate that I turned them down. In other cases, I probably would have been better off taking the offer. And I give
mm,
you examples. When I was leaving USTR, late 1989, early 1990, I had offers from Intel, AT&T, and T, and Motorola.
mm,
And I was interested in Intel because I had done a lot of work on semiconductors when I was at
mm,
USTR.
mm,
But many friends of mine, including in Silicon Valley and places like Stanford, said to me, Intel may have done pretty well up to now, but their days may be numbered. The large vertically integrated Japanese semiconductor companies like NEC, Hitachi, Fujitsu, Toshiba, Mitsubishi Electric. They're almost certainly going to overtake Intel. Maybe it will acquire Intel.
Wow.
So if you're going to go into international business, you should go to a company that has lots of resources, lots of technology, lots of money. And at that time, AT&T had about 300,000 people. They had Bell Laboratories with 7 Nobel Prize winners.
Wow.
So a lot of money, a lot of technology, a lot of capital. And I was interested in telecom. So I went to AT&T. But I was at AT&T 8 years. But when I left AT&T 8 years later, the shares that I had gotten from AT&T were worthless because the Telecom Act of 1995 changed the telecommunications market in the United States so much. AT&T went through a trivestiture voluntarily into AT&T, the services company, Lucent Technologies, the manufacturing firm, and NCR Corporation. So the telecom market was really much in turmoil. Now, Intel, between 1989 and 1999, during a 10-year period, their shares grew by 39 times.
Wow.
So
amazing.
If I had ignored the advice of the experts, and if I got Intel, I probably could have retired in my 40s with a multimillionaire, and I could have set up a couple of foundations, right? So that was an experience where, maybe I should have gone to Intel rather than AT&T. But the counterexample of that is in 1993, I was offered a job by Ron Brown, Secretary of Commerce, to be Assistant Secretary of Commerce for International Economic Policy. This was in January of 1993. And I asked him who's going to be my boss, the undersecretary. And he said, I just offered the job last week to Bob Hormats at Goldman Sachs. I'm sure he's going to come. So I said, well, I know Bob. I think I can work with him. But then the following month, in February, Hormats withdrew because he wanted something in Treasury rather than in Commerce. And it took Brown another several months to come up with Jeff Garten to be his undersecretary. And by that time, I had been promoted to vice president at AT&T. My wife had been promoted to partner at her firm. So it wasn't that attractive for me to make a move back to the government at that time. So I turned down the offer. The person who took the job I turned down was a guy named Chuck Meisner. He was in the airplane with Secretary Ron Brown that crashed in Croatia in April 1996. So if I had taken that job, I almost certainly would have been in that airplane.
Oh my
and
goodness.
I would have died in Croatia on that airplane. So that was an example of a job that it was good I didn't take.
Right, right. You never know with these things, both the way technology moves as well as the fate of everyone's lives. Absolutely.
Right.
Thank you for that. And I also wanted to come back to the Japanese American stories that we just talked about. And thank you so much for illustrating the different types of Japanese Americans that you've encountered over the years. And one of the things I wanted to ask about is the word bridge that you've mentioned in other interviews as well. So many people say that they aspire to bridge the United States and Japan. And you've said that that's not the best word because it's something that it's an infrastructure that people step on. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and your thoughts on
Sure.
that.
So many Japanese and some Japanese Americans say, Japanese Americans can be a bridge between the U.S. and Japan. And most people, when they say this, they mean it in a positive way. They mean, someone who can be an intermediary and who can smooth, linguistic and cultural differences and so forth. Someone who can kind of adjust between differences between U.S. and Japan. But in my own experience and seeing others, I think especially on the Japanese side, to some extent on the U.S. side, but especially on the Japanese side, and especially among older Japanese, they look at Japanese Americans as vehicles or instruments through which they can accomplish things. For instance, Mike Masaoka is someone I knew when he was working as a consultant in Washington, D.C. And in 1980, when I worked in Washington, D.C. at a law firm during the summer, he took me out to lunch. And he said to me, these Japanese, these companies, these government officials, they come to me and they ask me for advice. And so I give them advice and they want me to introduce them to people. So I introduce them to important people in Washington, but they don't pay me. They don't have any appreciation. And he said, whereas the Caucasians that they use as consultants, even if these Caucasians give them much less important information, much less valuable information, and introduce them to people who are much less influential than I can introduce them to, they'll pay these Caucasians. But they don't necessarily pay me, or they pay me much less. They don't value what I provide.
Right.
And so basically his message to me was don't sell yourself cheap, is what he was saying. Because I think it's not all Japanese, but some Japanese, I think, look at Japanese Americans, oh yeah, these people, we can use them to get access or do things. But a friend of mine who is in the Japanese government told me that it was only after he became a consul general of Japan on the West Coast. It's only after he became consul that he realized that when he recommended several Japanese Americans to receive the Emperor's Award, he was told by Tokyo that, oh, no, Japanese Americans, they have to do much more
Oh,
than
wow.
Caucasians in order to justify getting an award, because the logic, apparently, among some of these people is, if you're a Japanese American, you're kind of expected to contribute to U.S. Japan relations. Whereas if you're not a Japanese American, then you should be rewarded. And so that logic is still, I think, operating. So I think I've often had the experience myself that if I introduce people who I think are pretty influential people, whether in Washington or elsewhere, to Japanese. Especially government officials, I mean, they're very, very instrumental. And so they'll basically, once I introduce them, then they will establish those relationships and then totally ignore me, because I was a bridge that allowed them to make the connections or the entree that they wanted. So that's why I say the Japanese Americans should not relegate themselves to being a bridge. They should be actors. We should be people who actually have agency to do things. And we shouldn't just be used as a convenient bridge for other people to take advantage of.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And I think what you just said about uh, Japanese Americans needing to be actors and leaders in the US Japan relationship is really helpful. But do you have any specific advice on how they would go about that? Just try not to be too modest, or try not to have too much humility and things like that, or?
I think the most important thing is to have a expertise.
Okay.
Have expertise on whether it's tax law or whether it's cybersecurity or whether it's whatever it is. I mean, to be a real expert, to be really very, very knowledgeable about a subject. Hopefully, it's a subject that people in Japan would be interested in, because, as I say, I think people in Japan, especially leaders in Japan, are very, very instrumental. They're very instrumental. They're very results oriented. And so if you happen to have something that they value, then they'll pay attention to you. And if you don't have something that's of value, they'll ignore you. And so I think it's important to have something that they think is useful or of value to them.
Okay.
So I mean, in many ways, I think, I've been involved in the 1970s, 80s with JACL, in the 1990s and 2000s with Japanese American National Museum, and then more recently with the U.S. Japan Council. But I often think, too many Japanese Americans think that just being Japanese American is enough to be able to get involved and play a useful role in U.S. Japan relations. And I think from a Japanese point of view, that's totally wrong. Totally, it doesn't compute. It's only if you have something of value that is of that people in Japan think is useful to them that you can play a role.
Thank you so much for that. I think that's really inspiring as well, that we should be more active in whatever you do and try to aspire for leadership roles and not just connect the US and Japan. And I wanted to ask a little bit about your current activities at Stanford. Would you mind talking a little bit about what you do as a visiting fellow?
Sure. After leaving Japan in 2012, I went back to Washington and worked at the Center for American Progress. And then during the Biden administration, I was nominated to be vice chair of the Securities and Investor Protection Corporation, and I had to go through a 6-month process to get Senate confirmation,
Mm,
which I did. Um, but I guess I'd have to say that, since last year, I felt that Washington, D.C., the environment was turning in a direction that I didn't feel that comfortable. And so I happened to be meeting with former president of Stanford University, and he encouraged me to apply for a program at Stanford, which allows people who have had a career to spend a year at Stanford making a transition in their
mm,
career.
mm,
And so I think generally people between the age of 50 to 80 can apply for this program. And it only started about 10 years ago, but it's become very popular. And so I think Harvard and Notre Dame and Chicago, Northwestern, I think Duke, several other major universities have started similar programs.
mm,
What I'm working on now is to write a book about the ties between Silicon Valley and Japan.
mm,
I think there's been a lot of activity between Japan and Silicon Valley, but there's no book, to my knowledge, in English that explores that. And I think the ties between Silicon Valley and Japan will grow over time because I think, especially with artificial intelligence and it being one, but the other is dual use technology,
mm,
that the interest by Japan in Silicon Valley, I think, will grow. And I think in part because of the competition between the US and China, um, China's activities in Silicon Valley won't necessarily grow. And so I think that there's an opportunity for Japan and the United States to cooperate more in technology, especially with the AI and the services that and software that Silicon Valley produces. And Japan is still very strong in hardware, in
mhm,
manufacturing. So I'm doing lots of interviews now
mhm,
in Silicon Valley and also in Japan, and hope to write a book about this. So that's what
mhm.
I'm doing at Stanford.
Thank you. And that's really exciting and also timely because there's so many different technologies that I think Japan can contribute to the US and not just the other way around. And I'm really looking forward to that. Thank you for that. And speaking of academia, I also wanted to talk about the Fulbright Glen S Fukushima Fund that you established in 2022.
Mhm.
And you also created the Glen S and Sakiyati Fukushima Fund at your alma mater that you mentioned, Deep Springs College,
Mhm.
which is really, really wonderful. And looking at interviews and whatnot, where you talk about why you decided to establish a scholarship, you talked about the concern for the decline of Japanese students studying in the US. And I know this is an ongoing trend, but I feel like now that's even more of a challenge with all the political turmoil that's going on, as well as just being really hard for academia in the US in general, especially for foreign students.
Mhm.
And so I was wondering, how can we continue to encourage Japanese and other foreign students to come study in the US?
Well, I think the easiest way is to change the attitude and policies of the U.S. government toward
Right.
foreign students.
Hmm.
So I think the main thing is to vote. So
Okay.
that's the answer to your question.
Okay.
But I mean, aside from that, I mean, even I mean, it is a fact that 1997 was the peak of
Mm,
Japanese students coming to study in the United States, at least for 1 year on the college level. And from 1990, and at that time it was more than 47,000 students. And since that time, it's been on the decline. So that I think by 2012, I think it had gone down to about 18,000. And the most recent data I've seen, only about 11,500 or 12,000 students are studying in colleges in the United States for at least 1 year. The data is very tricky because the Japanese data collection decided a few years ago to, I think if a Japanese student spends like 1 week in the United States, they count that as a Japanese student studying in the United States. And so I don't trust the Japanese numbers very much. The IIE numbers, Institute for International Education in New York, I think their numbers are much more reliable. And those numbers indicate that Japan in 1997 was number 1. Now I think they're about number 12 in terms of the number of students studying in the United States. And so obviously, India, China, South Korea, I think Saudi Arabia, Korea, Vietnam, have many more students studying in the United States. And Korea, with less than half the population of Japan, has more than 3 times the number of students studying in the United States. And so, yeah, the number of Japanese students studying in the United States has, declined precipitously over the last number of years. And all my friends, in American universities talk about how the presence of Japan is almost non-existent in American universities these days.
And that's really concerning too, because I think we have been talking about Japanese youth becoming more inward looking for quite some time now. But now we see that in politics as well, like a harder stance on foreigners and immigrants in Japan, which is, I think, is really concerning. So I very much hope that this trend will reverse itself at some point. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the short-term study abroad opportunities. You talked about how even week-long study abroads are counted, but I think those are also important. You mentioned how spending 2 months in KO really was life-changing, and it led to a longer stint at KO later on. And you also talked about the importance of the Japan America Student Conference. So I was wondering if this is something that you think both governments can definitely focus on going forward as well, the short-term opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, I have many friends in both U.S. and Japan who talk about even being involved in a short-term program has really changed their lives for the better. And so, but I do think the U.S. and Japanese governments have, for at least the last 20 years, had all kinds of initiatives to try to encourage and promote students studying in both countries. But, there are all kinds of counter incentives. One being simply tuition. I mean,
Right.
a couple of years ago, Professor Ito, who was teaching at Columbia at the time, said the tuition differential, 1 year of tuition at the University of Tokyo versus Columbia University, he said it's 17 times.
Wow.
It's 17 times more expensive for tuition for 1 year at Columbia versus Todai. And so that's, cost is certainly one issue. Although you could say, well, that's the same. I mean, the Koreans and the Taiwanese and the the Vietnamese, and so that shouldn't be such a disincentive. But I think it is. Now with the yen being as weak as it is, and also I think until recently, the rewards for studying abroad were less in Japan than in other countries. If you're from Korea or China or from Taiwan or Vietnam or India, and you go to the United States and go to a selective school and do well, then you're going to be rewarded when you go back to your home country. Or even if you don't go back to your home country, you may have opportunities in the United States to work, and you'll be rewarded. Whereas until recently, most Japanese organizations didn't reward people for studying abroad. In fact, in some cases, they were penalized for having spent time abroad. So actually, about 12 years ago, Drew Faust, who's then the president of Harvard University, visited Japan. And she concluded after a week in Japan, she said, young people in Japan, they're acting in their rational self-interest. They realize they're not going to be rewarded for going abroad, so why go abroad? There's another view, which I find really interesting, which is a certain Japanese foreign ministry official told me this in 2012 when I saw him in London. He said, well, why should any young Japanese want to go abroad? We in Japan have created the perfect society. The trains run on time. There are more Michelin 3-star restaurants in Tokyo than any city in the world. It's safe, it's clean, it's comfortable. Why should anyone want to go abroad? If we go abroad, it's dirty, it's dangerous, there are diseases, we have to speak foreign languages, there's racial discrimination. Why should anyone want to go abroad? Which, kind of interesting that a foreign ministry official told me this,
Right.
but but it's not entirely untrue. I
Hmm.
mean, if you don't have to go abroad, why bother, right? It's more comfortable being in Japan.
Right, right. I guess you do have to have that innate interest to want to go explore other worlds and like
Hmm.
even if it's
Yeah.
more of a risk to you, I guess.
I mean, it is encouraging that in the last few years, I think Yanai of Uniqlo and Son of SoftBank, and also Sasagawa Peace Foundation, they've all created these scholarships for Japanese high school students
Hmm.
to have 4-year fully funded scholarships to study if they get it accepted by certain selective universities in
Hmm.
the United States, and I think in Britain as well.
Hmm.
So there are some changes taking place, but it's probably 30 years later than it should have been.
Mm-hmm. But I still think, though, scholarships like yours are incredibly important, especially because, yeah, with the weaker yen, and if for financial reasons, a lot of Japanese students cannot come, I think this is really, really helpful. So, yeah, thank you so much for doing that. And I also, as a former staff member of USJC, really appreciate your support for the all the Tomodachi programs too. You mentioned
Sure.
Yanai-san and Son-san and whatnot. So, yeah, thank you for
Hmm.
that. And related to that, I also wanted to talk about your sponsorship of the arts, which
Hmm.
I think is really wonderful as well. So you're on the boards of the Mori Art Museum and the Washington Bach Concert and others. So is art something that you've always been interested in? Is that a personal interest and that's why you sponsor them?
Well, music has been an interest of mine. I used to play the violin when I was a child
Mm,
for only about 5 years, so I gave up and I don't play anymore. But I love music, and so when I was in Japan, I lived, and I still my home in Tokyo is a 5 minute walk from Suntory Hall.
mm,
So I go to concerts a lot, both in Japan and also in Washington D.C. My whole home is about a 10 minute walk from the Kennedy Center, or the now Trump Kennedy Center. So I do go to a lot of music concerts, and
mm,
so until a few years ago, I was on the board of the Washington Bach Consort and Post Classical Ensemble. And in Japan, I've been supportive of the Bach Collegium Japan
mm,
that Suzuki Masaaki created.
mm,
On the art side, I picked up this hobby of when I would go to various cities around the world for business meetings, I would set aside one day, usually a weekend, so I could visit the museum. So when I was at Airbus, for instance, I
mm,
would go to Toulouse, but on my way to Toulouse, I would stop in Paris. So I got
mm.
all these museums in Paris. And then I would go to London to see all kinds of museums in London and in Berlin and Rome. And so it was, I think, my interest in wine and my interest in art really developed as a result of working for these 5 multinational companies that
Mm,
would have all kinds of meetings around the world
mhm,
where I would have the opportunity to visit. And going to a museum is a great way to understand the history of
mm,
that country and the
mhm,
culture of that country. So that's how I kind of developed this interest in going to museums. And then in Washington D.C., I was on the board of the National Portrait Gallery
mm.
at one point. And in San Francisco, I've been involved with the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art and the
Wow.
Asian Art Museum. Currently on the board of the Mori Art Museum
Mhm.
in Tokyo. And just the other day, I went to the De Young Museum in San Francisco because I'm a sponsor of an exhibition there on the art of manga. It's the
Oh,
largest
fun.
exhibition of manga in the United States so far. It's a
Really?
really
Mm,
very impressive and very, very popular
mhm.
exhibition. It's going to be in New York, let's see, October of this year, I think. And then recently I got involved in films, in
Mm,
supporting a film called Diamond Diplomacy about 150 years of baseball history between the U.S. and Japan.
mhm.
I'm also supporting a film on the life and work of Tezuka Osamu, the
Nice.
father of manga,
Mhm,
Tetsuo and Atomu,
mhm.
and Astro Boy.
Yep.
And recently I've gotten involved in supporting a film about Sadako's Gift. Have you heard
Okay.
about Sadako's Gift?
No, is it
It's
about the Thousand Cranes or?
yeah, yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
nice.
So yeah, so I got involved in film recently too.
Hmm. Hmm. Thank you so much. I didn't know that you used to play the violin. That's so awesome.
Yeah, yeah, I love
And
violin music. So I think I've had I mean, being in Tokyo, where all kinds of performers from around the world come, because Japanese listeners are very well informed,
hmm.
and also they're very attentive, very quiet, and very polite.
Hmm.
And so performers from around the world love to come and perform in Japan. So I think I've heard probably 70 to 80% of the world's top violinists, having lived in Japan for 22 years.
Wow.
And actually, in a week, I'm going to be in Japan, and Swanai Akiko,
Oh,
here at
nice.
Planetary Hall. And
Yes.
last November, Shoji Sayaka
Oh,
was
wow.
visiting, so I
Yeah.
hosted a dinner for her after
Oh,
her
wow.
concert.
Hmm.
And Stephen Isserlis, a cellist, is a
Hmm.
good friend. I've hosted him many times for dinners in D.C., San Francisco, Tokyo, also in London. So
Incredible.
yeah. Mhm.
Oh, that's great. I do believe that Japanese people have a really high appreciation for the arts. That's something that I think is evident whenever we visit museums in Japan versus other countries. And granted, Japan has like smaller land, so things tend to be crowded to begin with. But I think every time I go to a museum or the really tiny exhibit, like at the top of a department store or whatever,
Yeah.
they tend to be so crowded that you can barely see the, the thing, which is
Hmm.
really irritating actually. But when you think about it from a
Yeah.
long-term perspective, I think it's so wonderful that people just love the arts so much and really are
Hmm.
passionate about
Right.
yeah, everything that comes by.
One of the problems in the United States is that arts education and music education in the schools has really, declined over the years.
Mm,
And I think, frankly, in Japan, one of the reasons that there's such an appreciation for music and the arts is, Japanese educational system still does devote some time to
mm,
studying of music and studying of art.
mm,
And so I think it's very important. That's why I think education is so important. And I think that if, I mean, I notice, being in Washington, when I go to a lot of, especially classical concerts, that,
mm,
many of the people are over the age of 40 or 50
mm.
and maybe in their 60s and 70s or 80s, and
True.
there aren't that many young people. But
Right.
I think part of it is has to do with education, and so I think that's certainly one thing that I mean, supporting artists is important, but also supporting education in the arts is really important in the United States.
Hmm. Hmm. That makes sense. And when you just mentioned about the age range, I think it's really interesting how when we look at Japanese culture too, I think it depends on the type of culture, of course. If it's manga or anime, it tends to appeal to a lot of younger people. But when we look at the traditional Japanese arts, I think the audience members tend to be a lot older, and
Hmm.
I think it'd be really nice if we can appeal to younger audience members. I
Hmm.
think some kabuki artists are trying that with having all these modern kabuki, like One Piece and whatnot. But I think
Hmm.
there's a lot more to be explored in that area.
Hmm. Right. So there's a lot of traditional arts in Japan that, as you know, there aren't many successors, and so
Mm,
it's facing a lot of issues. And there are actually some, non-Japanese who are trying to create support organizations for traditional Japanese culture
mm,
because, um, I guess, in the view of many uh, outside observers, the Japanese government doesn't put as much support for traditional arts in Japan
mm.
as they might, and so
Okay.
I think the some of the more traditional arts in Japan um, are having difficulty finding successors
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
carrying them on.
Right. That makes sense. Yeah. I think one last thing I wanted to ask is, would you have any advice for people who might be struggling with their identity or struggling with trying to find a career that they want to pursue in terms of U.S.-Japan relations, or these people could be Japanese Americans who are struggling with their identity? Would you have any advice for them?
Hmm. Hmm. I guess, on this issue of identity, I guess at one point, maybe when I was in high school, maybe a bit in college, I did, think pretty deeply about these identity issues. But I guess because I've spent so much time going back and forth between U.S. and Japan that I have, the identity issues don't really bother me very much. I mean, because
Mm,
I feel very strongly that I'm a U.S. citizen,
mm-hmm,
and it's really interesting. Um, when Irene Hirano asked me to join the board of the Japanese American National Museum in 1992, and she asked me for advice,
mm-hmm,
the first advice I gave her was to change her meishi from using kanji for
mm,
Hirano to katakana.
okay.
And I said, I'm probably maybe one of only maybe 5% of Japanese Americans I know who insist on using katakana for my last name.
Mm,
Because I'm not a Japanese national. I don't have a koseki tohon.
mm,
There's a famous American journalist whose name I shouldn't say because he's very prominent and even now he's quite well known. He
mm,
wrote an article in the Atlantic Monthly in which he said something like, in Japan is so exclusive that even the famous trade negotiator Glen Fukushima, they use katakana for his last name. I said, wait a minute, I'm the one who wants them to use katakana. I don't
mm,
want them to use kanji.
right.
And so in that sense, my identity is clearly as an American. But, for me, one of the biggest compliments that I received in Japan, this was like 20 years ago when I was working in business in Japan, there's a very prominent Japanese business guy who I was with him at I think it was the German embassy in Tokyo, and about five of us were having a discussion. And this big party, and so this Japanese business person, myself, and then there was a German and an American and a Japanese. And the German guy said to me, "Oh, Mr. Fukushima, you really seem to know a lot about the U.S. and also about Japan. Are you American or are you Japanese?" And
Mm.
before I could answer, this Japanese, very prominent business leader said, "Mr. Fukushima is more American than Americans and more Japanese than Japanese."
Oh,
And I thought
nice.
that was really a compliment
Mm-hmm,
because I think what he meant was that I could adjust myself so that if I needed to be in a Japanese environment, I could be polite and I can be deferential and I can, you know, um, defer to seniority and do things that are necessary in Japan.
mm-hmm,
And if I'm in the United States, I don't necessarily have to worry whether someone is older than me or younger than me,
mm-hmm,
and I can pretty much speak my mind
mm-hmm,
without worrying about, so much about rank or seniority or that sort of thing.
mm-hmm,
I mean, when I grew up, my parents told me if there's someone in the room who's older or more experienced than you shouldn't speak up. You should listen. So that's
right.
how I was raised. But
Mm-hmm,
then after going to college and realizing that you get a higher grade for speaking up and
right.
for challenging not only your fellow students but also your professors in
Mm-hmm,
most cases, not all cases, some most
mm-hmm,
cases. So I think the two cultures have such different values and priorities, and so I feel I have to adjust, to each of those cultures. And so in that sense, I guess I don't really feel. I mean, I feel I'm definitely an American,
mm-hmm,
and it's from that basis that I deal with the United States and Japan. So I guess in that sense, I don't really have too much to offer in terms of people on the identity issue. Although my advice would be um, decide who you are and stick to who you are, and don't be kind of misled into thinking that you can be someone you're not.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, actually, to follow up on what you just said, I think for me that the code switching gets to be really complicated for after a while.
Hmm.
And I feel like there are only a handful of people who know both sides of who I am in terms of the
Hmm.
US side and the Japan side, because
Hmm.
um, there are only a few people, not a few, but there are just a handful of people that I can speak to in both languages fluently.
Hmm.
It
Hmm.
for American friends, they don't necessarily know my Japanese side and vice versa. So,
Right.
have you ever felt that sense of like wanting to be fully authentic, but having trouble finding people like that?
It's interesting. I actually, um, I guess I actually take pride, or I actually like the fact that I'm different.
Mm,
The
hmm.
fact that people don't fully understand me, to me, is
Okay.
actually, it's actually kind of fun to me.
Okay.
That it's, I think it's very difficult to understand me because I think I do know so much about the two societies and two cultures.
Hmm.
It's very difficult for Japanese to fully understand me. It's fully difficult for Americans to understand me. I think, like you,
Right.
because I do have these two aspects of my life
Right.
that it's not easy for people to understand.
Hmm.
I've talked with highly intelligent people that they 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 can't they don't have a clue about what I'm trying to explain to them about Japan because
Hmm.
they don't understand what it is to be immersed in a different culture.
Hmm.
And one of the things I find very disturbing is that in the U.S. government there are so few people at senior levels, and by senior levels I mean assistant secretary and above,
Hmm.
who actually have spent time in Asia
Mm.
working or studying, or can read Chinese or Korean or Japanese or speak. I
Hmm.
know very few people at the assistant secretary level and above. And so when you think in the world of business or law or academia or journalism, there are quite a few Americans who spend time in Asia and
Hmm.
speak languages and can read languages in Asia. But in the US government, there are hardly any people like that.
Hmm.
And it's a real tragedy, but it's a real danger, I think.
Hmm.
I mean, we've had a war with Japan, we've had a war in Korea, we've had a war in Vietnam, and now we're having these, you know, conflicts with China.
Hmm.
But how many people in the U.S. government really understand what's going on in Asia? It's amazing, how little diversity there is, and how little understanding of Asia there is in the U.S.
Hmm.
government.
Hmm.
And well, that I think is a real issue.
Hmm. Hmm. Okay, makes sense. Okay. Thank you very much for that valuable advice. I
Sure.
think that that covers everything I wanted to ask, but is there anything you'd like to add or?
Mm, no, I mean, I want to thank you, and really, I appreciate the work that you're doing as an interpreter, and also as someone who yourself has grown up, in the U.S. and Japan, but also spent time in England. I think you really bring valuable perspectives, and giving the opportunity to people like myself and others who have been grown up, not only in some cases not only in a bicultural, bilingual, but multicultural, multilingual background with very, very complicated life experiences. I think it's. I think in many of those people, um, because they don't often have people that they know personally that they can share experiences with, I think they'll find your program to be of use because they'll have, be able to hear about the experiences and thoughts of people who have experiences that are not exactly the same, but, there may be some things that they would find useful, some hints because of the analogous, experiences based on growing up in a multilingual or multicultural environment.
Thank you so much. That is definitely my hope. And same, I learned so much from talking to you just now, especially what you said about it's okay if people don't fully understand you. It's actually more fun that way.
To me, I find it really fun to that. I
Yeah.
mean, yeah, I guess I'm a person. I mean, I know some people that like to give the impression that they know more than they do,
Mm.
but I'm a person who actually likes to take pleasure in knowing what others don't know.
Hmm. Well, thank you so much for your time. I really, really
Sure.
appreciate it. I'm
Well, thank you.
sorry we went over
It's fine.
the time.
Well,
So
your questions are very interesting. So,
thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
sure.